So there was this man, and he was feeling kind of punk, feeling kind of lousy, wasn't doing very well, and so he decided, well, I think I'll go see a healer and see if something can be done for me. And so he arrived at the healer's office at the appropriate time, and she met him with her clipboard and said, come on into my office. And so they sat down together, and she looked at him, and he had a carrot in one ear and a banana in the other ear, and had some wheatgrass and some sprouts coming out of his nose. And she put her clipboard down on the table and said, I think I see what your problem is. That's awesome. You figured it out that fast? Yeah. It looks like you haven't been eating right. I know, it's awful. Okay, so a reminder this morning. We're looking at a text about Jesus. That Jesus is a healer. That's one of the things that he does. Isaiah says of the Messiah that by his stripes we are healed. We believe, according to the Scriptures, that Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Jesus says in Matthew's Gospel, where 2 or 3 have gathered together in my name, I'm there with you in the midst. And so the same Jesus who was in that synagogue 2,000 years ago is the same Jesus who's with us this morning. So I want us to look at this text together. So if you've got your Bibles, we're looking at this text from Luke's Gospel, chapter 13, page 872 in the Pew Bible. Reminder that in your bulletins, there's a place for you to write a few things down. There's a place for your head. If you learned something this morning, write that down where it says head. A place for your heart. Hopefully, I'll call you to believe something. And so write that down where it says heart. And then where it says hands, write something that you can take with you through the week or even later in our service this morning. Following the sermon, there's a litany of healing. We'll pray that together, and then I'll invite folks to come up to either side where Larry and I will pray for you and anoint you with oil. So we looked at this text together. Hear God's word one more time. And now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and behold, there was a woman who had a disabling spirit for 18 years, and she was bent over and could not straighten herself. Bum Phillips used to be the coach of the Houston Oilers. That's now the Tennessee Titans. And he said famously one time, there are 2 kinds of coaches in the NFL. Them that's been fired and them that are going to be fired. You know, the human condition is that there are those who are suffering, and there are those, if you haven't suffered, you've lived a charmed life, but you are going to suffer. That's the human condition. None of us escapes it. Some people believe, well, if we trust Christ, if we place our faith in Jesus, if we come to faith in Jesus, then we will become immune to the vicissitudes of life and to the ebb and flow of life, and we will avoid suffering. And nothing could be further from the truth. The enemy of God is Satan, and Satan will attack those who place their faith and their trust in Jesus. So we see this morning Jesus comes as an honored guest to teach and preach in the synagogue. And so they conduct their services and they sing some songs, some hymns, and then the guest who's been invited to teach and to preach will stand up and unroll the scroll. He'll read the text that he's going to preach from. He'll sit down, he'll sing some more. There's an order to the service. There's a bulletin. And so Jesus is in the synagogue on that Saturday, the Sabbath day, and he's teaching, and he sees in the back of the synagogue this woman. Now, commentators, they're not doctors, so I don't know if this is right or not, but they believe that this disease is Marie Strumple disease. And how it works, what it does is that people experience this agonizing pain in their back, but they notice if they lean forward just a little bit, it alleviates some of the pain. So they lean forward, and then their spine calcifies, and they experience pain leaning forward, so they lean forward a little more and the spine fuses. And so eventually the disease runs its course and they are bent over at the waist at 90 degrees for the rest of their life. This disease has no cure. It has no cure today. And so commentators think that this is the disease that the woman suffered from. Now, people who have a disease will do anything to get alleviation from that pain and from that suffering. So this poor woman has been suffering, it says in our scriptures, for 18 years with this malady. She has probably spent all the money that she has on doctors trying to get relief from this. She's experienced some probably trauma in relationships because she's kind of noticeable, bent over at the waist and walking around like this everywhere she goes. A pretty miserable life all in all. This disease has torn her up. Now here's Jesus at a synagogue. He's come to worship. And I want you to notice this. So Jesus gets up, and he's supposed to unroll the scroll, and he's supposed to read the text that he's going to preach from. But Jesus gets up, and he looks around the sanctuary. Now, this is the way the synagogue was set up. So you've got the rulers of the synagogue, and they sit in the front row because they're the big cheeses. And then the big givers and the people with power and prestige, they sit right behind the rulers of the synagogue. And then the men, according to their social rank, so the professionals or the wealthy, and then the laborers, and then the men fill in the pews. And then whatever's left, that's left to the women and the children and the slaves and the outcasts. They're at the back of the sanctuary. You know, Jesus is one who noticed people that the world, that the church usually ignores. So he doesn't look just at the leaders of the synagogue, and he's not there to seek their approval or to please them. He looks out and he sees this woman bent over at the waist. Now the scripture doesn't say that she had sought him out, that she came to the synagogue on that particular day. She was probably a regular member of the synagogue. She'd been suffering for 18 years. People were used to seeing her in her condition, and so it was unremarkable to them. It was no big deal to them. She was a woman. Women weren't accorded high social standing in the culture of that time. You know, Jesus sought out people, that the correct people, that the normal people, that the leadership people didn't pay attention to. He dealt with lepers, outcasts. He dealt with the diseased. You know, in the ancient world, if you suffered from a malady, if you were sick, if you were deaf, if you were blind, they believed it was because somehow either you or your parents had sinned, and it was payback for your sin. So here's this woman bent over at the waist. You remember the book of Job? Job becomes afflicted. Satan comes to God and says, hey, look, no wonder he praises you because you've done everything and blessed him. Let me take all that away from him and see if he still blesses you. And so his friends come to him and say, in his suffering, Job, you've sinned, confess your sin. Job hadn't done anything wrong. Perhaps this woman hadn't done anything wrong. Now, Jesus is looking at this crowd in the sanctuary, and he sees her. I want you to get this. This is the most important part today. Well, not the most, but one of the three most important parts. I have 3 points. That Jesus notices and that Jesus cares about and cares for the hurting, for the sick, for those that are suffering. That's who Jesus' heart goes out to. And so he sees her bent over, and he does a bad thing. Look at verse 14. But the ruler of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, said to the people, and I'll come back to verses 12 and 13 in a minute. But the ruler of the synagogue is indignant. Why is he indignant? Because Jesus is supposed to be reading from the scroll. He's supposed to then take a seat and instruct the people. Jesus isn't following the bulletin. What on earth is this Jesus doing? He's not following the program. Now here's a lesson for us. That Jesus says that people are more important than programs. That people are more important than religious rules. That people are more important than the liturgy. When there are people in our midst who are hurting and suffering, he expects us to have the same attitude of compassion and empathy and desire to help and care for them that he has. And the ruler of the synagogue was indignant. What if the bishop finds out that we didn't follow the rules, that we didn't do the order of the service? Oh my gosh! And he's indignant. How dare you do this? Well, what is it that Jesus did that made the ruler of the synagogue indignant? Let's go back to verses 12 and 13. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and he said to her, "Woman, you are freed from your disability." And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight, and she glorified God. Oh, what a jerk he is. He didn't follow the rules. He set aside the program. He didn't do what he was supposed to do, and he disrupted. I think the guy was Presbyterian. Everything has to be done in decency and in order. And he wasn't a Presbyterian. So he healed this woman on the Sabbath, and the leaders of the synagogue are outraged. You can't do that. We invited you in here as a guest. We expect you to observe propriety, to do the right thing. People are more important than programs. People are more important than rules. People are created in the image of God. They have inherent dignity and worth. And to the members of that synagogue, as I said earlier, she's invisible. She's anonymous. She's been this way since anybody can remember. There's nothing new here. Jesus, move on, follow the rules and the bulletin and the program. And Jesus sees her in her suffering. Now, in the ancient world, it was not an individual-based culture like ours. It was a community-based culture. And so the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. And so you don't want to be called up in front of everyone. You don't want to be called out in front of everyone. I am sure this woman was appalled, was aghast, was embarrassed. And yet here is this honored rabbi come to the synagogue, and he says to her, "Come up here." And she's looking around, and you can see the steam coming out of the ears of the rulers of the synagogue. What is Jesus doing? And he's talking to someone that he shouldn't be talking to. Men don't talk to women in that culture. You know, the Middle East, where they wear the hijab and all that business, that's the culture then. You only see the hair of your wife, but then they cover it and nobody else gets to see her hair is her glory. That's the culture. What is Jesus doing? I mean, he's trampling all over not just the rules of the synagogue, but the social mores of the time. He's having a conversation with a woman in a church service. We don't do that. Women sit in the back for a reason, and they need to be quiet and shut up. And Jesus says to her, "Come up here." And people are outraged, and she's embarrassed. You know, and I think for that woman, imagine, she spent all her money, she's been everywhere she can think of to go, and she's given up. She doesn't believe that God hears her prayers. She doesn't believe that God can touch her, that God can heal her, that God cares about her. Again, the prevailing attitude in the ancient world was, if something's wrong with you, it's because of your sin. So she feels alienated from God, and here is Jesus, God in the flesh, calling this woman forward in the synagogue. And he doesn't do anything crazy. He invites her forward, and he just puts his hands on her. And he says to her, "Your infirmity is gone. You're healed. Be well." And she, for the first time in 18 years, stands up straight and she praises God. In the synagogue? What's this? No, we're not having any praise in the synagogue. We don't do that here. My parents call those armpit services. I don't go to church to look into other people's armpits. I wish they'd put their arms down. She can't help it. She's excited. She's glad that God has done a thing for her, and here she is healed and well. And the response of the people? Outrage. Of the leaders of the synagogue, you didn't follow the bulletin, you didn't follow the rules, you're doing it all wrong. I can't believe you do this. And it wasn't crazy. She's not rolling around on the floor foaming at the mouth. He laid his hands on her. Be healed. She stands up straight and she praises God. Now, first point, Jesus notices and cares for the outcast, for the hurting, for the despised, for the broken, for those that the rest of the world doesn't pay any attention to. Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So if Jesus sees her, he sees us in our pain. He sees us in our hurt. He sees us in our brokenness. He sees us in our unworthiness. Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Jesus is here with us this morning, and he sees you with your pains and with your hurts and with the things that you struggle with. Now, if all that Jesus did was to show compassion and empathy and sympathy, that would be a good thing, but that wouldn't be much help to us. Second point, Jesus has the power to do something about it. Jesus has the power to heal. Jesus has the power to set what's wrong right. Jesus has that power today. He hasn't changed. Jesus is present with us. That's his promise in Matthew's gospel. He's here with us this morning. He hasn't changed. And so he sees you in your hurt, in your brokenness, in your pain, in your suffering, and he has the power to do something about it. Now, the scriptures say here that it was a spirit that kept this woman bound. But I want you to notice the language of the ruler of the synagogue. He doesn't say that Jesus delivered her. He didn't say that Jesus cast out a demon. Jesus didn't come to her and say, "Demon, who are you?" and then gets the name of the demon and casts the demon out back to the pit. No, Satan is the cause of sin, of sorrow, of shame. God didn't create that. You know, it's amazing to me as a pastor when I meet people in their grief and in their pain and in their suffering, they'll say things to me like, why did God give me cancer? Why did God take my child? Or why did God take my spouse? Why is God allowing my family to be torn apart and blown up and separation and divorce and all of these bad things? Why God, why? You know, that was the prevailing thought in the ancient world, but I don't think human nature changes, and I think many of us kind of feel the same way. When bad things happen to us, we shake our fist at God. But remember what the Scriptures say. It isn't God that brought sin and shame and suffering into this world. It was Satan who brought those things into this world. And this woman's attack was an attack on her physical body by a disease. It doesn't say anywhere that she was demon-possessed. You've seen what's the name of that movie? The Omen or whatever. The girl's head spins around and, you know, I mean, she's not possessed. Satan attacks her where Satan can attack her, in her body, in her health. When you have your health, you have everything. He took it away from her. When you have a happy family and a happy marriage and good relationships, so Satan enters in and he sows seeds of discord and separation and tries to break those things apart. It's Satan who brings trouble and discord and pain into this world. It isn't God. God, Jesus said, I came that you might have life and have it abundantly. And Satan wants to come and take that away from us. I'm not a health and welfare gospel preacher. I mean, I don't believe that Jesus, who walked the earth in the first century and didn't heal everybody in Palestine, I don't know the will of God. I know what the Scriptures teach, but He didn't heal everybody then. He doesn't heal everybody now. But He does heal some people then, and He does heal some people now. This is a woman who had no faith. She'd given up. It'd been 18 years of this pain and agony and misery. And so Jesus takes care of her problem. She wasn't demon-possessed, and it isn't God that's causing the problem. Now, just one quick story, and then we'll move on to our service of healing. I don't know how you are about healing, but I grew up in the 70s. And I didn't think a whole lot of it. I mean, there were TV preachers, Oral Roberts, and there was a guy that just drove me nuts, and now I'm drawing a blank on his name, Ernest Angley. Lay your hands on the television and be healed. And so I thought they were all a bunch of charlatans. It was all a big joke, and I didn't believe in divine healing. And so Cheryl and I moved from Chesapeake, Virginia to Woodbridge, Virginia. It was the last weekend of a healing conference at a church that we were thinking about going to. It was an Episcopal church. And I had been having problems, pain in my back, and I didn't know what it was. I'd been to the doctor's the week before. He took an x-ray, and there's this big white dot in the middle of my back. He says, that's a kidney stone. Oh, crud. And when that thing moved, it was like a hot poker in the back. And so I'm sitting in church with Cheryl, and it starts to move, and so do I. That's awful. And she's sitting next to me, and they've asked people to come forward to receive prayer for healing. And, Matt, why don't you go up there? I don't believe in that crap, a bunch of nonsense. I don't believe in that. And, what do you have to lose? Well, I don't have a good answer to that question. I got nothing to lose. So I went up. And the rector of the church, John Guernsey, is a good friend. He takes his vial of oil and he anoints me and he prays for me. Now, the book of James, chapter 5, the Lord's brother, Jesus' brother James, says this. If any of you are sick, if any of you are suffering, come, get the elders of the church to come and lay hands on you and pray for you and anoint you with oil in the name of the Lord, and the Lord will raise you up. And so, I mean, the Scriptures teach it. I just didn't believe in it because of the way that I'd seen it done, and I didn't believe in that. It had nothing to do with my faith. I can tell you that. I didn't have any faith in this. So I come up, and he prays for me, anoints me with oil, and I go back and I sit down, and the pain goes away, and it's gone. A few weeks later, it's gone. I go back to the doctor's, he takes another x-ray, there's no kidney stone. I didn't pass it. It just went away. Now, I didn't get zapped with a lightning bolt. I wasn't rolling around frothing on the floor. I didn't get hit with a boulder out of heaven. I didn't feel weird or any different. It's just that the pain in my back disappeared. And when I went back to the doctor's, that little white dot that was on the x-ray, that dot went away. So it doesn't have to do with your faith. And it doesn't have to do with the power of either me or Larry, because that's not It's Jesus. The same Jesus that touched that woman and raised her up in the synagogue is, the same Jesus that's here with us this morning.